Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and Thomas and his wife were preparing for a trip east on a one-year leave that Thomas had acquired, but a national political crisis was unfolding. The Thomases first traveled to Vicksburg to visit George's brother. Then they split ways, with Francis heading to New York to visit family, and then would proceed south to Southampton County, Virginia. On the way from Vicksburg to Southampton, Thomas stepped off the train for a moment during a nighttime stop in Lynchburg, Virginia. Misjudging the distance from the train to the platform in the darkness, he fell off the platform and down an embankment, severely injuring his back. Thomas continued by train to Norfolk, but he was so badly injured that he could not travel by coach from Norfolk to Southampton. Francis came down to Norfolk to care for him, and after a few weeks, George recovered enough to travel to Southampton. He stayed there until January 8th, then left for New York. But he made a stopover in Washington. He visited with Winfield Scott, and they discussed the Secession crisis. Then he and Francis traveled to New York. There, he seriously considered leaving the Army due to his injury. The Virginia Military Institute had an opening for Commandant of Cadets and Instructor of Tactics, so he asked to be considered for that position, but did not receive the appointment. On March 9, 1861, Thomas did receive a letter from William Gillum at the Virginia Military Institute, but it wasn't about a position at the Institute. But the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, wanted to offer Thomas the job of Chief of Ordnance for the state of Virginia militia. Additionally, William Mahone, a state legislator from Southampton County, wrote a letter to the governor advocating for Thomas to be given that position. On March 12th, he wrote to Governor Letcher that, "It is not my wish to leave the service of the United States as long as it is honorable for me to remain in it, and therefore, as long as my native state remains in the Union, it is my purpose to remain in the Army, unless required to perform duties alike repulsive to honor and humanity." On April 6, Winfield Scott asked Thomas to return to duty with the 2nd Cavalry and be its commander. Those who remained loyal to the Union were traveling from Texas to New York City by ship, so Thomas needed to meet them there and prepare them for service. General Twiggs, the commander of the Department of Texas, had turned over all their equipment and horses to the Texas government. Although he was still severely injured, he told Scott that he may not be able to take the field as a commander for a few months, but he accepted the job to organize the 2nd Cavalry. He met the unit in New York City on April 12th, and then proceeded to the cavalry training facility in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He arrived on April 14th, and 3 days later, Virginia seceded. Thomas's opinion of secession was not cut and dry, it was nuanced. Thomas did think that the people of the country had a natural right to rebellion, as Americans had exercised in the Revolutionary War, but they could only do so justly in response to tyrannical rule. In the present case, Thomas reportedly said Southerners did not have the right to rebel, as the tyranny did not exist, and they well knew it. He criticized officers who supported secession because they had broken their oaths of service to the Constitution. The government cannot dissolve itself, he stated. It is the creature of the people, and until they agreed by their votes to dissolve it, and it was accomplished in accordance therewith, the government to which they had sworn allegiance remained, and as long as it did exist, I should have adhered to it. Before the Tennessee legislature in 1866, Thomas stated that his loyalty to the United States came from the oath he had taken when he entered the Army. He had promised to sustain the Constitution of the United States and the government, and to obey all officers of the government placed over me. I did not regard it so much as an oath, but as a solemn pledge on my part to return the government some little service for the great benefit I had received in obtaining my education at the Academy. When he informed his family that he was choosing to stay loyal to the United States, his family grew angry, although his sisters were much angrier than his brothers. George asked his sister to send him his effects, including his ceremonial sword, but she refused, stating that if the people who awarded it to him agreed to it, then she would, but not before. He had left his 2 slaves with the family in Southampton, and they were taken care of by his brother John, and all expenses that John had to take care of George's slaves were recorded as expenses owed by George. His sisters blamed his wife for turning him away from the South, but Frances stated that George never spoke to her of such matters. Nevertheless, his sisters saw him siding with the North as a betrayal of his family for his wife. His brothers would forgive him, but his sisters would not. He not only lost his family, but he lost thousands of dollars that he had invested in Virginia banks. Siding with the Union was not an easy choice because he had so much to lose by doing so, but his loyalty to his country overrode those losses. Not all of his troops made it to Carlisle before he was ordered to bring as many companies as possible to Washington to defend it against a possible attack from Virginia. Some of the companies still hadn't received horses, but by April 22nd, 4 companies were ready and led by Thomas by rail to Washington. On the way there, Secretary of War Simon Cameron sent word to Thomas to not move through Maryland because it was feared that the pro-secessionists would become more rebellious. So, Thomas was ordered to guard the railroads running from Pennsylvania to Maryland. To illustrate the uncertainty of the situation, when the 2nd Cavalry arrived in Carlisle, one man chose to leave the army and head back south. When they boarded the train for Washington, a soldier turned to Thomas and asked, "What shall we do?" referring to loyalty to country or state. Thomas replied, "We are ordered to Washington, and there we go. There will be time enough after getting there for you to decide what to do." While in the vicinity of Maryland and Pennsylvania, Thomas was called on to stop a mutiny by a New York regiment who had signed 3-month enlistments and claimed that they had served their time and were determined to go home. They planned to commandeer a train to head back there. At dawn, the regiment stopped the train. Then the men stacked their weapons and prepared to get breakfast before boarding the train. Thomas walked into their midst and announced that he had something to say to them. A large crowd gathered, expecting a speech. When they were all clustered around him, Thomas took off his cap and waved it over his head. At this signal, a battery of artillery moved forward on one side, a loyal infantry regiment moved in on the other, and a cavalry detachment rushed in between the men and their guns. "There is your train," Thomas said. "I will give you 5 minutes to decide whether you will go back to duty or to the military prison at Dry Tortugas." All but 20 decided to go back to duty, and the rest were placed under arrest. 19 of the 36 officers in the 2nd Cavalry resigned to join the Confederacy. Paranoia ran rampant through the regiment and the country. The War Department ordered each man to take the oath of loyalty again. One officer in the regiment called it uncalled for, and when he asked Thomas his thoughts, he stated, "I do not care a snap of my finger about it. If they want me to take the oath before each meal, I am ready to comply." When word spread to the 2nd Cavalry that Benjamin Butler had been defeated at the Battle of Big Bethel, one officer stated he was glad the abolitionist was whipped. Another officer took offense and said he was fighting for the wrong side. Thomas would later step in and say that if the first officer truly believed in his statement, then he was fighting on the wrong side, and then declared there to be no more talk about this being an abolition war. In Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, on their way to Harper's Ferry, Thomas got to spend time with his friend William T. Sherman. Thomas believed the war would be long and bloody, and in that country tavern in Chambersburg, the two men spread out a large map of the United States on the floor and commented on the most vital parts of the country and where they thought major battles would happen. They pointed out Richmond, Vicksburg, Nashville, Chattanooga, and Knoxville as key locations. Thomas led his men into Virginia and then back into Maryland, waiting for Union forces to gather for a more substantial invasion. Jeb Stuart found out that Thomas had stayed loyal to the Union and wrote to his wife that, "Old George H. Thomas is in command of the cavalry of the enemy. I would like to hang him as a traitor to his native state." Thomas and his men crossed the Potomac River on July 2nd, and on their way to Martinsburg, they heard fighting nearby. A Confederate force under Jeb Stuart and Thomas Jonathan Jackson were posed to obstruct any invading force. Thomas now commanded a brigade of Pennsylvania infantry as well as his 2nd Cavalry. His force formed on the left of the Union units already engaged, and they overwhelmed the Confederate force. The enemy fell back and the Union Army captured Martinsburg. Although in control of part of northern Virginia, the force which Thomas was a part of was afraid of being cut off from their base of supplies. Their objective was to block Joseph E. Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley from joining P.G.T. Beauregard's army near Manassas. When they pulled back to Charlestown, they skirmished regularly with Jeb Stuart's cavalry, which kept them from realizing that Johnston had moved his men by rail to link up with Beauregard. Thomas's commander was replaced by Nathaniel Banks for allowing Johnston to get away. However, Thomas would not stay in the East long. Major General Robert Anderson, the defender of Fort Sumter, was assembling a force to defend Kentucky, and he was able to select 4 brigadier generals. He chose William T. Sherman, Don Carlos Buell, Ormsby Mitchell, and after a recommendation by Sherman, George Thomas would join them. Thomas was headed to Kentucky and would continue in the Western Theater for the rest of the war.